How is it possible that the United States has no legal definition of honey? Not a weak definition, not an outdated definition, no definition at all. The FDA has never established a federal standard of identity for honey. That means there is no legally enforceable federal standard specifying what honey must contain, what it cannot contain, how it must be processed, or what minimum pollen content it must retain. The word honey on an American label is, in regulatory terms, a suggestion, not a guarantee. And the consequences of that regulatory vacuum are staggering. A landmark food safety news investigation tested more than 60 samples of store-bought honey and found that 76% of honey purchased from grocery stores had all the pollen removed. At drugstores like Walgreens, Rite Aid, and CVS, the failure rate reached 100%. Every single sample had been stripped of its pollen. Why does that matter? Because pollen is the only foolproof method of identifying where honey comes from. Remove the pollen and you erase the origin. Erase the origin and you cannot determine whether that honey was laundered from China, cut with high fructose corn syrup, or contaminated with banned antibiotics. The FDA itself has stated that ultra-filtered honey from which all pollen has been removed, should not be considered honey, but the FDA does not routinely test store honey for pollen content. It has the position, it lacks the enforcement. The United States imported 429 million pounds of honey in 2023. That represents 73% of total American honey supply. In FDA testing conducted between 2021 and 2022, 10% of imported honey samples were found to be adulterated with undeclared sweeteners like corn syrup, cane sugar, rice syrup, or beet sugar. In 2023, the European Commission found that 46% of sampled honeys were suspected of adulteration. The problem is so severe that Apimondia, the International Federation of Beekeeping Associations, canceled its honey competition at the World Beekeeping Awards for 2025 because fraud had made fair judging impossible. At the 2019 competition in Canada, 45% of entries were rejected for suspected adulteration. The food and beverage industry spent over $23 million lobbying the federal government in 2025. The National Honey Board, funded by mandatory assessments on honey producers and importers, focuses on promotion rather than quality enforcement. Congress directed the USDA to submit a report to the FDA describing how a standard of identity for honey would benefit consumers and the industry. The USDA concluded that there were divergent opinions on the content and wording of such a standard. That was in 2014. More than a decade later, the FDA still has not established one. The honey industry remains the only major food category in America without a federal standard of identity. And every year that passes without one is another year that adulterated, laundered, and fraudulent honey flows onto American shelves unchallenged. Let us follow the money, brand by brand, loophole by loophole. Number 16. Great value. Honey, Walmart's store brand and the private label sourcing loophole. Great Value is one of the most widely purchased honey brands in America. Walmart does not produce honey. It contracts packaging and sourcing to third-party suppliers who blend honey from multiple countries. The label may say product of a blend of honeys from various countries or list multiple origins, but the consumer has no way of verifying the actual composition. When the world's largest retailer purchases honey at the lowest possible price on the global commodity market, the incentive to source from the cheapest and least transparent suppliers is enormous. The FDA does not require private label honey brands to disclose their specific supply chain, their blending ratios, or whether their product has been ultra-filtered. A consumer buying Great Value honey is trusting Walmart's procurement team to verify authenticity. Given the scale of global honey fraud, that trust may not be warranted. And at $3 a jar, the math simply does not support the cost of producing authentic, unblended honey. Number 15. Busy Bee honey is distributed by Honey Holding Company. This is about the packer versus producer loophole. Busy Bee is a widely distributed brand found in grocery stores across the southern and eastern United States. Honey Holding, its parent, is one of the largest honey packers in the country. Packers are not producers. They purchase bulk honey from domestic and international sources, blend it, process it, and bottle it under various brand names. The FDA does not require packers to disclose which producers supplied the honey in any given bottle. The consumer sees a brand name and assumes a relationship between the brand and the bees. That relationship may not exist. The brand is a marketing entity. The honey is a commodity, sourced from wherever it is cheapest, blended to achieve consistency, and processed to achieve the clear, golden appearance American consumers expect. That processing often involves heating and filtering that degrades enzymes, removes pollen, and eliminates the very characteristics that distinguish real honey from sugar syrup. Number 14. Sioux Bee honey is produced by the Sioux Honey Association, one of the largest honey cooperatives in the United States. The cooperative marketing loophole is a factor. Sioux Honey is a cooperative of American beekeepers, which gives it an authenticity advantage over imported blends. However, even domestic cooperatives face the pressure of competing against cheap imported honey that may be adulterated. The broader regulatory failure is that honest American producers are undercut by fraudulent imports because the FDA lacks the testing infrastructure, the standard of identity, and the enforcement budget to level the playing field. Sioux Honey has advocated for stronger honey standards, but the absence of federal action means their premium-priced domestic product competes on the same shelf with imported blends that may contain undisclosed corn syrup or rice syrup, sold at half the price. The consumer cannot tell the difference by reading the label. The regulatory system does not require anyone to help them. Number 13. Gunter's Pure Honey is a regional brand based in Virginia, and the pure labeling loophole. The word pure on a honey label has no legally enforceable federal meaning. The FDA guidance from 2018 recommends that products labeled as pure honey not contain added sweeteners, but the guidance is non-binding. It is a recommendation, not a regulation. Any honey brand can put the word pure on its label without independent verification, without third-party testing, and without penalty if the product turns out to contain undeclared additives. In the absence of a standard of identity, the word pure is a marketing claim, not a regulatory assurance. The consumer reads pure and infers that the product is unadulterated. The law does not guarantee that inference is correct. The gap between what the label implies and what the law requires is the space in which honey fraud operates, and that gap has been open for decades because the industry has never been forced to close it. Number 12. Dutch Gold Honey is based in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. This is the country of origin blending loophole. Dutch Gold is a large packer that sources honey domestically and internationally. Their labels may indicate blends from multiple countries of origin. Country of origin labeling for honey is required by the Tariff Act of 1930, but enforcement has been inconsistent. The U.S. Department of Justice documented a major case in 2021 where Chinese honey was shipped through Vietnam, Malaysia, and other countries to avoid $164 million in anti-dumping duties. This practice, called transshipment or honey laundering, exploits the gap between country of origin requirements and actual enforcement capacity. A consumer may read product of Argentina and Brazil on the label. Consumers have no way of knowing whether the honey actually originated in those countries or was routed through them from China. The molecular testing that can detect this laundering is expensive, and neither the FDA nor Customs and Border Protection has the resources to test more than a fraction of imported shipments. Number 11. Glory Bee Honey is based in Eugene, Oregon. Glory Bee offers both conventional and organic honey. Organic honey certification requires that bees forage in areas free from prohibited pesticides, and that no antibiotics or synthetic chemicals are used in hive management. However, organic certification for honey is inherently difficult to verify because bees forage over a radius of several miles and cannot be confined to certified organic land. The USDA organic standard for honey relies on the certifying agent's assessment of the foraging area, but this assessment is necessarily imprecise. Additionally, organic certification does not protect against adulteration with sugar syrups. An organic honey that has been cut with rice syrup is no longer organic, but without a standard of identity and routine testing, the adulteration may go undetected. The organic seal provides a meaningful baseline for hive management practices. It does not guarantee purity of the final product in the bottle. Number 10. Store brand honey from America's largest retailers, Kroger, Aldi, Target, and Costco, and the bulk commodity pricing loophole. Kirkland Signature from Costco, Simple Truth from Kroger, Clover Valley from Dollar General, and Good and Gather from Target all source honey through large packing operations that blend domestic and imported product. The economics are straightforward. The average cost of producing honey in the United States is significantly higher than the average import price from countries like India, Vietnam, Brazil, and Argentina. When a retailer sells a 2-pound bottle of honey for $6, the margin required to cover production, packaging, transportation, and profit leaves very little room for authentic, unblended product. Something in that equation has been compromised. Either the beekeeper is being paid below the cost of production, or the product has been stretched with cheaper sweeteners, or both. The label does not tell you which. And without a standard of identity, no one is required to find out. Number 9. Bee Harmony and other brands marketed as raw, and the undefined raw loophole. The term raw has no legal definition when applied to honey in the United States. There is no federal regulation specifying the maximum temperature to which honey can be heated and still be called raw. There is no required enzyme activity threshold. There is no pollen content minimum. A honey producer can heat their product to any temperature, filter it to any degree, and label it raw without violating any federal law. Some producers use raw honestly to indicate minimal processing. Others use it as a marketing term with no verifiable standard behind it. The consumer pays a premium for raw honey, believing it represents a higher quality, less processed product. In many cases, that belief may be correct, but the regulatory system provides no mechanism to verify it, no enforcement to punish misuse, and no standard against which to measure the claim. Raw on a honey label is a promise made by the company to itself. No one else is checking. Number 8. Madhava honey and similar natural brands, and the wellness marketing loophole. Madhava positions its honey as a natural, better-for-you sweetener, part of the broader wellness food trend. The product may well be high quality, but the regulatory issue is that honey marketed as a health food is subject to no greater scrutiny than honey marketed as a commodity sweetener. The FDA does not require additional testing, certification, or verification for honey brands that charge premium prices based on wellness positioning. The markup reflects the marketing, not a measurably higher regulatory standard. In the absence of a standard of identity, there is no legal distinction between a $3 jar of commodity honey and a $12 jar of wellness honey. Both are regulated identically. Both are subject to the same non-existent testing requirements. Both can contain the same undisclosed additives or processing methods. The only verified difference between them is the price the consumer pays and the story the label tells. Number 7. Manuka honey brands sold in the United States, and the international fraud loophole. Manuka honey produced from the Manuka bush native to New Zealand and Australia commands prices of $30 to $60 or more per jar because of its documented antibacterial properties. The global demand for Manuka honey far exceeds the supply that New Zealand and Australia can produce. Industry estimates suggest that the amount of Manuka honey sold worldwide is several times greater than the amount actually produced. This mathematical impossibility means a significant portion of what is sold as Manuka honey globally is fraudulent. New Zealand has implemented the Manuka honey science definition, requiring specific testing to verify authenticity. The United States has no equivalent standard. An American consumer paying $50 for a jar of Manuka honey has no federal regulatory assurance that the product is authentic. The FDA does not test for Manuka authenticity. There is no standard of identity for Manuka honey in the United States. The premium price reflects the perceived value. The regulatory protection reflects the American standard for all honey, which is to say, no standard at all. Number 6. Wholesome sweeteners. Honey and similar fair trade brands and the ethical sourcing verification gap. Wholesome Sweeteners offers organic and fair trade certified honey. Fair trade certification verifies that producers receive a minimum price and that labor conditions meet certain standards. These are meaningful certifications that address important ethical concerns. However, fair trade and organic certifications do not include routine testing for adulteration with sugar syrups or verification of pollen content. They certify the process, not the purity of the final product. A honey can be legitimately fair trade certified and still be adulterated downstream in the supply chain during blending, packing, or distribution. The certifications add value, but they do not substitute for a standard. In the United States, the standard of identity that would close this gap does not exist. Number 5. Miller's Honey and similar bulk brands sold at warehouse clubs, and the volume economics loophole. Large format honey containers, the 3-pound and 5-pound jugs sold at warehouse clubs, represent the highest volume segment of the American honey market. These products are priced for value, which means they are sourced from the cheapest available supply. The U.S. imported nearly 73% of its honey supply in 2023. India and Vietnam alone accounted for 40% of imported honey in the FDA testing sample. Vietnam has been repeatedly identified as a transshipment point for Chinese honey avoiding anti-dumping duties. India had 1 violative sample out of 29 tested. Vietnam had 3 out of 28. Yemen had 4 out of 4. The consumer buying a 5-pound jug of honey at a warehouse club price point is statistically more likely to be purchasing blended imported product from high-risk origins than a consumer buying a small jar from a local beekeeper. And the statistical risk of adulteration increases proportionally with the volume and the discount. Number 4. Billy Bee and other Canadian origin brands, and the cross-border standard gap. Canada has a standard of identity for honey. It requires the product to be the natural, sweet substance produced by bees. Canadian standards include specific limits for moisture content, sugar composition, and conductivity. These are meaningful quality parameters. However, honey that meets Canadian standards becomes subject to the American regulatory vacuum once it crosses the border. A Canadian-produced honey can be blended with cheaper imported product by an American packer, and then sold under a brand that implies Canadian origin, while the Canadian standards no longer apply to the final blended product. The country of origin on the label may say Canada. The contents of the jar may tell a different story. FDA does not test at a scale that would catch this kind of downstream blending. Number 3. L'Abeille Occitan, Barkman's, and imported honey brands sold in specialty stores. The premium price authenticity assumption loophole. Consumers who shop at specialty food stores often assume that higher price equals higher quality and greater regulatory oversight. For some imported honey brands, that assumption may be correct, particularly for products from the European Union where the honey directive sets specific quality standards and where the EU now requires NMR testing, nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy, for all imported honey to detect adulteration at the molecular level. But the United States does not require NMR testing. It does not require any specific testing methodology for honey authenticity. A product imported from the EU may have met EU standards before export. A product imported from countries without equivalent standards may have met no meaningful quality threshold at all. The specialty store shelf creates an environment of assumed quality. The regulatory system does not enforce that assumption, and premium pricing, while often correlated with better product, is not a substitute for verified standards. Number 2. Amazon and online marketplace honey brands. The digital marketplace enforcement vacuum. The fastest growing channel for honey sales is online retail, particularly Amazon and similar marketplaces. These platforms host thousands of honey sellers, including many offering Manuka honey, raw honey, and other premium categories at prices that often undercut brick-and-mortar retail. The FDA's enforcement capacity, already limited for physical retail, is even more constrained in the online marketplace. Honey sold by third-party sellers on Amazon may be shipped directly from overseas, bypassing the import screening that would apply to traditional bulk shipments. The platform itself does not test products for authenticity. The listing may feature compelling photographs, positive reviews, and premium pricing. The honey in the jar may be adulterated, mislabeled, or fraudulent. The consumer has even less recourse online than in a physical store, because the seller may be anonymous, located overseas, or operating under a different name by the time a complaint is filed. The digital marketplace is where the absence of a standard of identity and the limits of enforcement capacity converge to create the optimal environment for honey fraud. Number 1. The FDA, the agency that has no standard. The Food and Drug Administration has the legal authority to establish a standard of identity for honey. It has been urged to do so by Congress, by the USDA, by the American Beekeeping Federation, by state regulators, and by consumer advocacy organizations. The 2014 Farm Bill directed the USDA to submit a report to the FDA on why a standard would benefit consumers and industry. The USDA did so. The FDA published non-binding labeling guidance in 2018. But a standard of identity, a legally enforceable definition that would specify what honey must contain, what it must not contain, what testing must verify, and what penalties apply for violations, has never been established. The consequences of this failure are comprehensive. Without a standard, honey remains one of the most adulterated foods in the world. Without a standard, the word pure on a label is legally meaningless. Without a standard, the terms raw and unfiltered have no enforceable definition. Without a standard, ultra-filtered products stripped of all pollen circulate through the American market with no mechanism for detection. Without a standard, imported honey laundered through third countries to evade anti-dumping duties enters the supply chain unchallenged. Without a standard, American beekeepers who produce authentic honey cannot compete against fraudulent imports priced below the cost of honest production. And without a standard, the consumer standing in the grocery aisle holding a plastic bear full of golden liquid has absolutely no way of knowing whether they are holding honey or something else entirely. The food and beverage industry spent over $23 million lobbying in 2025. The broader agribusiness sector spent hundreds of millions more. The FDA has conducted limited sampling that found adulteration rates between 3 and 14% in imported honey, acknowledging that the problem persists. The EU found suspected adulteration in 46% of sampled honeys and responded by implementing mandatory NMR testing. The United States responded with non-binding guidance and no standard of identity. The EU has a legally enforceable honey directive specifying composition requirements, quality parameters, and labeling standards. The United States has none. The Apimondia World Beekeeping Organization canceled its honey competition because fraud has become too widespread to judge fairly. Over the past decade, the United States has lost thousands of beekeeping operations as honest producers were priced out of the market by adulterated imports they could not compete against. The regulatory framework is not just absent, its absence is the framework. The lack of a standard is not an oversight. It is the result of a decade of inaction following a congressional directive, sustained by an industry that benefits from the ambiguity and a regulatory agency that has chosen not to act. What is the alternative when your government will not protect you? You protect yourself. Local beekeepers at farmers markets represent the most reliable source of authentic honey. When you can meet the person who tends the hives and ask about their practices, the supply chain is one person long. No laundering, no blending, no ultrafiltration, no undisclosed sweeteners. Really Raw Honey, based in Baltimore, Maryland, sells completely unprocessed honey that still contains pollen, propolis, and honeycomb. Their product is about as far from ultra-filtered commodity honey as it is possible to get. Bee and Flower Farm and similar small batch producers sell single-source honey with verifiable origin and transparent practices. These operations typically test their product and can trace every jar to a specific apiary. Wetherspoon Manuka honey, sourced from New Zealand, is one of the few Manuka brands that meets the New Zealand government's Manuka honey science definition, providing a level of authenticity verification that the American market does not require. Desert Creek Honey, based in Texas, sells raw, unfiltered honey from their own apiaries with full transparency about sourcing, processing, and testing. Savannah Bee Company, based in Savannah, Georgia, sources from identified apiaries and offers a range of varietals with traceable origin. These producers prove that selling honest honey is commercially viable. Most grocery store honey is not honest because the system does not require honesty. And the system does not require honesty because no standard of identity exists to define what honesty means. When shopping for honey, buy from local beekeepers whenever possible. Look for honey labeled with a specific geographic origin and a specific floral source. Look for raw and unfiltered honey, understanding that these terms are not legally defined, but producers who use them are more likely to be operating transparently. Look for pollen visible in the jar, a sign of minimal processing. Be skeptical of any honey priced significantly below the cost of production, because at those prices, something other than bees made what is in that container. Avoid ultra-filtered honey, which the FDA itself has said should not be called honey, even though no one enforces that position. Let me be direct about what this investigation has revealed. The United States has no federal standard of identity for honey, despite a congressional directive more than a decade ago. 73% of American honey is imported. The FDA found adulteration rates of 10% in its 2021 testing and 3% in its 2023 testing. The European Commission found suspected adulteration in 46% of sampled honeys. The Apimondia World Beekeeping Federation canceled its honey competition because fraud made fair judging impossible. The Department of Justice documented a $164 million honey laundering operation routing Chinese honey through Southeast Asian countries. Food safety news testing found 76% of grocery store honey had all pollen removed, making origin verification impossible. The FDA has stated that ultra-filtered honey should not be considered honey, but does not test retail products for pollen content. The terms raw, unfiltered, and pure have no legally enforceable federal definitions for honey. The EU has implemented mandatory NMR molecular testing for imported honey and maintains a legally enforceable honey directive with specific quality parameters. The United States has non-binding guidance and no standard. American beekeepers have lost thousands of operations over the past decade, priced out by adulterated imports they cannot compete against because the regulatory system does not distinguish between real honey and fraudulent product. The FDA has the authority to establish a standard of identity for honey. It has been asked to do so by Congress. It has been urged to do so by the USDA. It has been begged to do so by American beekeepers watching their livelihoods destroyed by fraud. The agency has the power to stop. It has chosen not to act. And every year of inaction is another year that adulterated honey floods the American market. Honest producers go out of business, and 330 million consumers pour something onto their morning toast that may not be what the label says it is. The system is not broken. There is no system. There is a label, a price, and a plastic bear. And behind all three, there is nothing. No standard, no definition, no enforcement, just a regulatory vacuum that the honest cannot survive and the dishonest cannot resist. Legal does not mean real. It means no one ever defined what real means.